Hello, BookTube. Recently, and by that I mean a long time ago, this channel reached 12.8k subscribers, which is kind of amazing. And I put out a call for questions to do a usual Q&A, our usual thing, and then catastrophe struck here at Hyde Cottage, and I was subjected to construction that is ongoing and that appears to have no end in sight. And that sort of disinclined me. I became so irritated on a day-to-day basis that the only time I was calm and happy was when I was out walking with the bean, not thinking or talking in English. But recently I have begun to see the glimmers of hope that this process is not endless. And that's when I remembered that I have a lot of videos that I have to make, and one of them is our 12.8k Q&A. So I copied all the questions over and I put them on the trusty iPad here. And this is in fact, my old trusty iPad. This is my iPad 2, my second generation iPad, Little Henry, which for a long time sat unused in a tech closet that doesn't exist anymore. That whole wall doesn't exist anymore. And when I realized that construction was going to take over everything, I grabbed, a Hanoi airlift of technology into this room where it would be safe. And one of the things I grabbed was this iPad 2 with its power cord. And it just sat here on the shelf. And then I was looking at YouTube and stumbled across a video about someone asking, can you use an iPad 2 in 2022? And I watched the video, and the Ponce doing the video, I wanted to slap him several times. Because, the iPad came out 10, 12 years ago, and his tone of voice was, did they even have electricity 12 years ago? I just wanted to slap him and say, we got along just fine without you. But it reminded me that this is a perfectly fine device. The only problems that were making it seem unreliable 2 or 3 years ago was the power cord, not the device. The device is a workhorse. It will last forever. So I've got your questions all lined up on here. We're going to go through them in batches until we get to the end. CVBN457, oh my God. Last time for 12.7k Q&A, CVBN457 asked a liberal amount of questions. I wonder if he's going to control himself this time. Steve, you've mentioned before that you came to reading later in life. With that in mind, I find it fascinating that you ended up making books essentially your life's work. I know, quite the irony. I came late to reading after mocking it for quite some time, and now it is literally my life. What's the story? How did it happen? Who introduced you? What was that first book that changed everything? Was one teacher. I had one person. I mean, I had a slew of teachers, the way everybody does, but I had one person that I suspect is the way of it for a lot of people. I had one person who just sort of broke in, opened up the portcullis and showed me the light. One person who showed me that reading was an adventure. That it wasn't a contemptible thing to do at all. That it was, in fact, the greatest adventure of all. And the book that did it was the Iliad, to start with. This thing that I knew backwards and forwards, but I didn't know it as a book at all. And seeing it, experiencing it as a book made all the difference in the world. Realizing that I was experiencing it in a different way than anyone else who would look at it would be experiencing. I've been making up for lost time since then. Let's see here. Vigard Dale says, number one, thank you for your constant generosity. It hasn't been all that constant in the last couple of weeks. Number two, questions. Are you still writing the self-help book? I meant it as a quasi-joke. I should do a self-help book. I could rake in the money. I could rake it in. If I did a self-help book, 150 pages, Steve's Guide to Life, that sort of thing, and put real precepts in there. In other words, not sarcasm, real precepts, and charged $5 a copy for it, I could make a squintillion amount of money. I could afford a whole different crew of workers. But no, I am not at the moment working on it. Should I be? You know several languages and have many times stated your interest in translated works. Thereunder comparing translations of the same book, example, War and Peace. Have you done any translation yourself? Have you been tempted to / considered working as a translator? I've never considered working as a translator. I've also never considered using the word "they are under," and neither should you. But I have done translations, yes. In the past, 2 or 3 times, under the exact same circumstances, where someone pointedly asks me to do it. And then I have done it. A long chunk, an entire book of Livy for one person. Suetonius' Life of Tiberius Caesar for a different person. And it was those are always a lot of fun. Also, a small chunk of Froissart. And I think I got to one of the familiar colloquies of Erasmus for another person. I was going to do a whole bunch of them. I think I only did one. Let's see here. Mary Tumulty. Recently, much to my own dismay, I reread The Red Badge of Courage by Stephen Crane. Why would that be to your dismay? Decades after hating it as a 20th century 8th grader, I was blown away by how good Crane's writing is. This was especially apparent when compared to a much admired 21st century Pulitzer Prize winning novel set in 19th century Virginia that was a struggle to finish. I think I know what you mean. Crane's use of hard to decipher vernacular dialogue was probably a very off-putting element when I was an 8th grader. At what age did you first read it? I read it a long, long time ago. Did you enjoy it? I do enjoy it very much so. Did you ever teach this novel to young students? No. Let's see here. Bell Bottom Blue says, "Hi, Steve. Before I ask a question, I want to thank you for recommending the Boston Girl book. I loved it. I'm originally from Boston myself. Question. Have you seen the series that's airing now called All of Mankind? What do you think of it?" I haven't seen it. I don't think I even have it. I have advanced screeners of a whole bunch of stuff that I haven't got to. But there's a lot of stuff that's not advanced anymore. I'm sure it's out already, but there's a lot of it that I haven't got to. Let's see here. John M. Congratulations on another milestone, Steve. I recently had the good fortune to be able to shop at Lelo and Brother bookstore in Porto, Portugal. It is the most beautiful bookstore that I've ever been in. I will assume you've been there. I have not. I have been to the town, but I haven't been to the bookstore. And I'm wondering where it ranks on your list of most beautiful bookstores you've shopped in. I would be the wrong one to ask about the beauty of bookstores. Sam, what renders the acceptance of relating neurotic symptoms to a perfectly articulated language difficult is the fact that we don't see to whom they are addressed. They are not made for anyone, since the ill person, in particular the ill person himself, does not understand them, and a specialist is needed to decipher them. Maybe the hieroglyphics have become incomprehensible, but at the same time they were made to communicate certain things to certain people. So what is this neurotic language? It is not only a dead language, it's not only a private language, since it is incomprehensible to oneself. And then a language is something that we use. This one, on the contrary, is infringed upon. Take the obsessional. He would certainly like to get rid of his fixed idea, get out of the trap. Okay. There's no questions there, and the reason is obvious, because the poster is a sociopath. In other words, a significant danger to himself and everyone around him. The difference being a sociopath is someone who's alone in the world. This is not a question at all. It's not involved in this video at all. It doesn't know that I exist or that you exist or that other people exist, because a sociopath is alone in the world. That's how you know them. They don't have any empathy because there's no one to have empathy with. They are alone in the world. That's what differs them from a psychopath who's not alone in the world. A psychopath is in a heavily populated world, but everyone in the world other than the psychopath is a mortal enemy of the psychopath, a danger, someone they need to fight, someone they need to hate. A sociopath is a more pathetic thing, and I think because of the huge amount of mood-altering medications that have been given to an entire generation of people starting 30 years ago, I think we have a lot more of them than we ever did, and this is an example of one. This is a sociopath. Just putting a long Jordan Peterson-esque comment, disquisition, into a comments field designed for asking questions. So I don't know. Let's just move on from it as fast as possible, as is the way to do with sociopaths. Joseph Cater says, "Hey Steve, I love Star Wars novels. Don't worry, I read other things as well. It wouldn't matter to me if you don't read other things as well. As long as you love what you read, it wouldn't matter to me. As long as you don't make heirs, as long as you don't make any claims to me, then I'm happy to hear it. I'll ask you questions until the cows come home." And I quite like the film novelizations and stories from the perspective of the Sith. You know they're the bad guys, right? I hope you do. Are, in your opinion, the only one that matters? Very good. Nice save. The best Star Wars novels. Well, the one that I really enjoyed was the very first one, Splinter of the Mind's Eye by Alan Dean Foster. I'm an Alan Dean Foster fan. I might also mention, well, I mean, we're going to do Timothy Zahn, right? Heir to the Empire is a great science fiction novel that is also a Star Wars novel. It's no surprise to me that it was so popular. And also recently, James Luceno, I think his name was, wrote a book called Tarkin about Grand Moff Tarkin that I thought it was stiff. And of course, there's barely anything that it can do. Its parameters are set in stone, but I thought it was still fairly effective. But I also want to recommend, what's his name? Matthew Stover's novelization of The Revenge of the Sith is remarkably good. It isn't ordinarily with novelizations you think, oh my god, it's going to be the writer was hired at the last minute, handed a shooting script and told we need 80,000 words next week. So they don't have a chance to make anything of it. And I thought he did a really good job. Joanna Burgess says, I want to thank you for your book recommendations. I recently read along with you and Michael K. Vaughan, Lonesome Dove. I also read Northanger Abbey. Thanks again. Well, not a question, but I'm always happy to hear that my recommendations are landing. Isaiah Armstrong, congrats, Steve. A couple of random questions for you. You've mentioned you have a knack for pulling books out of people. I do. How many of these books have been published? What are the most well-known ones? Well, the most well-known ones are well-known. They can stand on their own. They don't need me talking about them, but there have been quite a few. I'd say my track record so far for not only pulling a book out of someone, which is a success on its own. That's all I care about. But if we were to extend the track record to pulling a book out of someone and getting it all the way to readers, I'd say my track record is probably in the upper 40s, which is not bad, considering the increasingly great obstacles against that sort of thing. But the major obstacle, the biggest problem, is always the first step, and that is igniting the fire in someone. It's easy for me to see the book that someone has inside them, whether they see it or not. It's easy for me to see it, and if they have a whole bunch, it's easy for me to pick out the one that should get the concentration, whether they do it or not. I know my instincts in this are never wrong. And once I've done that, then the hard part starts, because, right, that's like rolling a rock up a hill. It's not just that the book is inside them. It takes a lot to get a book out of someone. And you can't do it. I can't do it myself. What's needed at a certain point is work habits. And that means building work habits in people, and that's really hard to do. Getting people to understand that the clock is ticking and that they owe it to everyone, not just alive today, but everyone coming, especially the people who aren't here yet. You owe it. It's an obligation. It's not just a fun lark. It's an obligation. You owe it to get that out into the world. It only exists in you. No one else can duplicate that. So it's not like, you're going to serve on the city council, but in 20 years someone else will serve on the city council and you'll be completely forgotten. You're the only person who can create that. But sometimes it takes a particularly sexy midwife. Let's see here. How many American presidents have you met in person? I don't know the number. It's quite a few. It's quite a few. How often do your anonymous reviews for Kirkus reviews get blurbed on the book? Do you keep track? Well, it happens. I'd say it probably happens. I don't keep track. No, I couldn't possibly keep track. But I'd say it probably happens about 50 times in a year, maybe 30 to 50 times in a year. But by the huge preponderance, no. Because the huge preponderance, well, I guess the huge preponderance is what I review for Kirkus is for their indie branch. So it's not books that you would ever hear about. It's not books that you would ever know. It's not books you would ever see in your bookstore. I imagine those authors all have their own web pages. So it's possible that those blurbs have been used countless times. I have no idea how many. Thousands. Well over 10,000 of those. I have no idea how many of those have been used. No idea at all. Scott Pearson says, I enjoyed your poetry readings and hope you do more. Well, yes, my poetry book was buried. It's under a tarp somewhere. I even managed to get a copy of the new Poetry Sans Dust Jacket, of course. Well, okay, that was the volume that I was talking about. I found it in the Little Free Library. And I fell in love with it, and we were doing poetry readings from it until the walls caved in here, quite literally. I have no idea where that volume is. I know it's a little bit silly on my part. I could this little book room has many poetry anthologies in it. I could easily use one in here, but I kind of like that book. If I find it, I will reassume those. Question number 1: how do you rate Theodore Roethke's poetry? I don't particularly like it. Never really have. Number 2: what are your impressions of The Changing Light at Sandover? I'm struggling with its complexity. For those of you who don't know what Scott is talking about, The Changing Light at Sandover is the big epic poem by James Merrill, a poet I love. And complexity is one thing you could certainly struggle with when it comes to that poem. Another thing could be that it's totally inward looking. It doesn't want you to understand it. It's written for a small group of friends who were gathered around the Ouija board, or who were gathered at luncheons after or before sessions on the Ouija board. It's one of the few poems that Jimmy Merrill ever wrote that isn't really designed to be understood by a general reader. So no wonder you're struggling with it. I would say you're not struggling with its complexity. It's not all that complex a poem. I would say you're probably struggling with the fact that on every page, virtually every verse, you feel like there's something you didn't get. Well, that's not complexity. That's that there is something you didn't get. Unless you get a fanatically annotated version. I don't think there is one. Who was it that did? Somebody did recently. Was it FSG? Did a beautiful uniform set of Merrill's work. His nonfiction, his poetry, and a separate volume for Changing Light at Sandover. Really well designed. With, cannily enough, his face on the cover is nice and big. If you look like James Merrill, you should have your face on every book. But I like the book. I probably know a lot more about its groundings than the average reader would, and I think that's necessary. So I wouldn't beat yourself up if you're not getting it. Jordan Parsons. Hi, Steve. Congrats and thank you for the endless content. Well, it hasn't been endless lately, has it? I feel like I owe all of you an apology for dropping off the radar. But the radar machine is under a tarp somewhere. I really try not to judge anyone who eats meat, but the human treatment of animals is undeniably a colossal atrocity living right under our noses. He's absolutely right. And it's not just eating animals. Jordan could go a lot further, right? His heart is given to the most abused species of animal anywhere in the world, rats, who are delightful and intelligent, extremely affectionate, playful, moody, individual. He knows this far better than I do, and even I know this. And rats aren't even tortured for food. They're tortured totally redundantly. Totally redundantly. In experiments all over the world. All the time. For the last 100 years. If there is a rat god, humanity will not escape justice. Any advice on being open about your principles without coming across as insufferably preachy? I do have advice. You're not going to like it. Especially in light of the fact that this is an ongoing atrocity, something horrible. My advice is don't say anything. Unless you're directly confronted, don't say anything. So if you go somewhere and meat is being served, either politely eat the non-meat alternatives or politely eat the meat without commentary. It's already dead. The machinery is already in place, God knows. Millions and millions of dollars invested in the machinery. It's not gonna damn your or blot your immortal soul to not be to be a good guest, when meat is served. But in terms of talking about your principles, it is utterly useless. Completely useless. It will never have any effect at all that you want. It will have negative effects, but it won't have any positive effects. Better by far. If it's a personal decision, an inner moral personal decision, then that's what it is, and that ought to be good enough. I myself will not gratuitously participate in this cruelty. I will do it from time to time when occasion warrants, but I will not otherwise. If that makes you feel better, warmer in your own set principles, that ought to be enough. Confronting other people about it never does any good. Never. In fact, it makes things worse. So I would say my advice about being open about your principles is don't be open about them. Who cares about your principles? Nobody. Nobody cares about your principles. We do. Here at BookTube, I care about your principles quite a bit. But the strangers, they don't want to hear what you believe and don't believe. If you're at a backyard cookout, I don't imagine you as the type, but if you were at a backyard cookout, somebody's handing around hamburgers, I can't think of anything more counterproductive for you to do than to stand there like Joan of Arc at the stake and say, well, I don't want this because it got here through torture. Everyone listening to you. It's not going to change a single mind, so I wouldn't do it. I had to learn that lesson the hard way. Shelf Life writes a 5,000 word block of prose. Despite my continuous cautions against doing that. So now we have to read a 5,000 word block of prose. Recently, I've seen a lot of pressure put on authors to be active on social media, especially when it comes to debut authors. Now, I know perfectly well, I haven't read the rest of this because I just ported this stuff over. I know perfectly well that this block of prose, there's 4,000 more words to read, could have ended there with, what do you think of this? That sentence, and then what do you think of this? But instead, it seems to me that publishers would rather publish a mediocre book by someone with a large platform, yuck, than a good book by someone without one. Of course, financially this makes sense. It is in the publisher's best interest to reduce risk, cutting down on market costs to boot. However, debut authors who flat out refuse to be on social media may easily be discriminated against, and I fear that having a following, yuck, is becoming a requirement as important as delivering a good manuscript. My sense is that this is happening already, but have you had any experience or heard talk to that effect on your end of the industry? And if so, what are your observations about genres most affected by this? Is every genre a celebrity memoir now? And that is the end of the block of prose. I know quite a few authors, quite a few young authors, quite a few first-time authors, people who are just getting out in the world. I personally have not had any of them be approached by their publisher saying, we need you to up your social media presence. Most of them have very scanty or no social media presence. I've known very few publishers to come forward and say, that's part of our marketing campaign, you need to do this work. So I don't know how prevalent it is in the big five. It could be prevalent in smaller publishing houses. Certainly, even if you're at a smaller publishing house or indie publisher, even if your publisher doesn't come to you and suggest it, you'd be crazy not to do it. It isn't a question of being a social media sellout. It's a question of getting the word out about your book. You never know who's out there who might be interested in knowing about it and doesn't. That's actually true, even with the big five. They tout themselves that the huge advantage they offer you over indie publishing is that they will get the word out about your book, but they almost never do. They're worse at it now than they ever have been. I know mainstream published authors in the last 10, 15 years who, once their book comes out, have been told by the publisher, right, we're sending you a box of copies of your book. Put it in the trunk of your car and get on the road. Go to the nearest 200 bookstores. When once upon a time, those books would have been waiting for you and you would have been on planes paid for by your publisher. But because they're hoovering up profits up the chain, they don't have the money to spare on that for most lower tier authors. But in answer to your final question, is every genre a celebrity memoir now? The answer is unquestionably yes, especially contemporary fiction. Rishab Karki says, as an engineering student, I find it very difficult to manage time for books, non-engineering related, of course. Even if I want to read every single day, did you face similar problems in your early years? If so, how did you manage your schedule? Well, I'm still in my early years, bub. Okay, 28 is still very young. But there's only one way to do this. And you're not going to like the answer. No one ever does. I don't know why you people keep asking me this kind of question. When you know you're not going to like the answer. You do have time to read. I unconditionally guarantee it. Every single time that anyone has ever told me that they simply don't have time to read in their busy, busy schedule, and I have had access to that schedule, I have been able to spot oceans of time available for reading. Oceans of it. Now, if you're a rare example and you literally don't have any time to read, where you get up, you grind all day long, you're at school, you're at classes, you're at a job, you're at your family obligations and whatnot, your head hits the pillow at 11 and you are as tired as a dead body, then what, if that is literally true, that you literally never have a spare minute in the day, then give up reading. Give up the idea of it. You can no more do it than you could be an international ballerina. Just give up the idea. Don't keep beating yourself up and asking me questions about where you can find the time if there's literally no time in your day. If that's not true, and it isn't, then there is time in your day to read. The way that I did it in my early years was to decide to prioritize reading. It was, a year ago, 2 years ago, Eric Carl Anderson made a video on this subject and said the absolute truth of it, incontrovertible truth of it. If you want reading to be a part of your life, you have to make reading a part of your life. It's not going to be that way without that. You have to make it that way and keep it that way. He's right. So let's see here. J. Scott Phillips. As we all know, rule number 1 for your channel is do not mail Steve a book. But how many other rules are there? There are lots of rules. I was trained by the best. My guess, rule number 2, send Steve your old tech. Rule number 3, eyes on the prize. Am I close? Are there any other rules we should be aware of? Rule number 1 is don't send me tech. Or don't send me a book. Right. No matter what you think. Unless I ask for it. If you clear it with me ahead of time, or I ask for it, maybe then. Rule number 2 is Steve is always right. Many of you have gone astray. Many of you have tried to display your impetuous adolescent independence, only to discover eventually that Steve is always right. Rule number 3 is definitely send Steve your old tech. I will give it a loving home. I will give it a workout. I will make sure that it does not sit, especially now when I am short on tech. Most of my old tech is probably lost forever. Probably it was destroyed in all of this construction. It's certainly tarped over or boxed up somewhere that I'll never find again. So I'm deficient in old tech. You should send me your old tech. As long as it works, as long as it's not, defective in any way. I don't want your junk. But if you have a piece of old tech that works just fine that you don't use anymore, definitely send it to me. But I have other rules? Yes, I do. Oh, yes, right. Rule number 5 is don't smash that like button. Rule number 6 is don't hit the bell for notifications. And rule number 7 is don't share this video far and wide. So you're not going to get those rules on other channels, but you'll definitely get them here. How are we doing for time? Oh, we've got a little time left. Eric has a barrage of questions. Let me start by saying you are an intergalactic treasure. Now for a barrage of questions. Number 1. What do you think of John Gardner might have gone on to do in his career if he hadn't died young? Well, he wore a helmet, that's for sure. But I assume, would have kept writing books. I'm hoping that he would have drifted further and further into nonfiction. Number 2, which 20th century writer, in your opinion, should have won the Nobel Prize for Literature but did not? Not so far. Ngugi wa Thiong'o, I think, should have won well, he wrote a big fat book. I mean, you don't win for a book, you win for a career. But he wrote a big fat book years ago that should have won. It should have been the thing that tipped over the Nobel Committee. But the Nobel doesn't matter anymore. They gave it to Dylan. They gave it to Bob Dylan. So it's irrelevant. A different kind of Nobel Prize for Literature, sure, it would be him. Number 3, what are your thoughts on the essays of Elliot Weinberger? I don't like them. I think you probably guessed that, right? Number 4, thoughts on the work of Maggie Nelson? I don't particularly like it. I think you probably guessed that, right? Number 5, if permitted to do so by school administration, how would you approach the task of teaching the Canterbury Tales to a class of high school English students? I have done this, and it works. Chaucer makes it easy. Chaucer makes it easy. The key thing when teaching the Canterbury Tales to high school students, especially high school boys, the key thing is to avoid art. Avoid art like the plague. I'm not saying that art isn't there. Oh my God, the Canterbury Tales are full of art. It's amazing what Chaucer does. I would argue, Tom L.A. Books would probably thumb wrestle me for this, but I would argue that it's the equal of the art in the Divine Comedy. But you have to stay away from it. Oh my God. Oh my God. Like the plague, like it was radioactive. The minute you even hint at the presence of art in anything, you will lose all of the teenage boys in your class and probably a lot of the teenage girls as well. You want to stay away from that completely. And fortunately, Chaucer makes it easy. If you remove the subject of art from the Commedia, you'll be okay for the Inferno. Where will you be with Purgatory and Paradiso? You won't be anywhere. You won't have anything to talk about. But the Canterbury Tales is also full of people. And they are people you know. It doesn't matter that it was written so long ago. They're people you know. That's the approach that worked with me, is that these are people that you know. Keep that in mind. Keep in mind that Chaucer is punching down. Teenage boys love that. They love the look of that. They like nothing better than watching endless scrolls of YouTube videos in which skateboarders lose control of their spin and nail their gonads on a guardrail. They like nothing better than epic fails. And you have to point out to them, Chaucer is punching down. There are types of people in his world at the court who are very much not present in any of the tales. They're not there. Instead, there are people that he can mock. There are people that everybody likes to poke fun at. And once you see that, the human element of that, oh my, that works. That absolutely works. I've had it that the kids thought it was deadly dull, old stuff on the first few days. And then after a week or two, they wanted to read it. They wanted to read more. They wished that it were finished, that Chaucer had finished it. Well, that would be my way to do it. But oh my, we're out of time. We're going to come back for our part 2 here.